There's a famous quote that a picture says 1,000 words. What do these pictures tell you? That the travel industry is problematic. Every second, there are 45 new arrivals somewhere around the world. And while that in itself isn't a problem, there are a slew of environmental and humanitarian factors in its wake. In 1950, there were 25 million international tourist arrivals. In 1970, that number was 106 million. And by 1990, that number grew to 435 million. In this year alone, over 1 billion people will travel somewhere. And by 2030, that number is projected to be more like 1.8 billion. We as visitors, of course, we want to see the most beautiful places around the world. One example would be Maya Bay in Thailand, that stunning location for the movie The Beach, starring Leonardo DiCaprio in the year 2000. In less than 2 decades, Maya Bay went from this to this. Maya Bay accepted up to 5,000 visitors per day. Boat pollution and even chemical ingredients in sunscreen led to the irreversible destruction of the coral reef. And of course, this led to the beach famously closing in 2018, with a representative from the Thailand Department of Preservation, Wildlife, and Plant Conservation quoted that the bay was completely destroyed by the time of its closure. So, in a turn of irony, our overpresence at these beautiful places often leads to the degradation of them. A study by Tumali found that about 85% of floating marine litter consists of plastics, which are mainly generated within the tourism industry. And this includes things like single-use plastics, beach items, food wrappers, and clothing made from synthetic fibers. Statistics like these suddenly make it clear why stunning places like Maya Bay just simply can't withstand the volume of visitors they receive. Perhaps now is a good time to introduce myself. I'm Erin. I'm a travel writer and blogger on Earth2 Editorial. I've spent the last 6 years writing stories around the world and the entirety of my life falling in love with places. Now, all the aforementioned points probably sound pretty ridiculous coming from someone in the tourism industry and who also loves to travel. And admittedly, I've probably been to my fair share of places where maybe I have contributed to some of the problems that they're facing in some ways. Maybe I didn't even realize. But being so close to crowds helped me see the problem and the solution a little bit more clearly. Now, you might be thinking, well, the only solution to overtourism is to not travel. But I'm actually here to challenge that idea. This video is going to raise awareness about some of the issues surrounding overtourism right now, but it also discusses the ways in which we as travelers, including myself, can see the world more consciously without sacrificing the dignity of the places that we want to go see. It's clear that there's a big problem with travel, but what happened? And why does it seem like all of a sudden these problems are happening right now? The truth is, there has been a slow burn happening behind the scenes. Although the term influencer has had meaning since the 1600s, believe it or not, it took a whole new definition in our lexicon starting around 2016. And that was with the rise of social media marketing. Prior to social media, brand partnerships and gifted vacations were things really only reserved for celebrities and super elite. But when it came to possibly growing a following and actually getting payout from that, people started to go haywire. What started as a platform as innocent photo sharing between friends and family, of course, then turned into a mega digital sales space where people were quite literally becoming famous and millionaires because of the photos that they shared. For the tourism industry, this translates into a competition of who has the best vacation and who has the best photos. Seeing one person explore all of these impossibly cool places with seemingly endless amounts of money left a lot of us asking what we did wrong in life. So if a picture says 1,000 words, then what are the 1,000 emotions a picture like that makes us feel? Is it guilt or jealousy? But instead of getting down on ourselves, a lot of people decided to take the high road and decided it was time to visit all these impossibly cool places for ourselves. So hashtags like bucket list travels, travel inspo, and beautiful destination get upwards of 66.7 million posts. Anyone who's on social media knows how quickly information spreads there. And so all of a sudden, if 100 videos show up for a place that you want to go to, then you might as well put that place on your destination bucket list or maybe even book a ticket to go. But when it comes to the perfect formula for over-tourism, one cannot forget about an essential factor: a global pandemic. Beyond any influencer, the dumpster fire of 2020 set off over-tourism at a monumental scale. All thanks to COVID, we collectively replaced travel plans with baking. We prioritized sourdough rather than passport stamps. But what was about to happen kind of reminds me of a story my friend was telling me a few years ago. See, in 2020, she was planning to get married, which obviously didn't really happen the way she planned. They had to cancel the wedding and reschedule it, of course, due to the pandemic, and her venue said that they could book a tentative date in the following year, except there was just one problem. Every couple who planned on getting married in 2020 now had to compete with couples who had scheduled their dates in 2021. So the venue was already booked for dates for the following year, and now that meant that there was going to be an extra overlap of additional dates scheduled. So an influx of rescheduled weddings layered with weddings that were already booked. And in the case of tourism, when countries began reopening their borders around 2021, 2022, so did the influx of tourists who had to hold off on their travel plans for the previous 2 years. So you see, a lot of issues in contemporary tourism weren't problems a few decades ago, or really even 5 years ago. In some cases, these issues are happening really in real time. A picture says 1,000 words, and behind a smiling face is often a sprawling background full of heads, hundreds, if not thousands of people crammed into one place. And now there's evidence that some of these places can't handle all the capacity. This hyperpopularity of specific places leads to what I would call clout travel. It's when someone travels to a super specific or well-known area just for the sake of getting pictures and the claim to fame that you were there and you got to see it. There's evidence that shows some of these spots simply can't handle the number of tourists that they received. And the results could be so severe that some places might even cease to exist. Take Venice, for example. This magnificent city was built on water and had a local artisanal spirit for hundreds of years. And it also inspired some of the greatest minds in history. One can't forget that Venice itself has an incredible background of seafarers and explorers, which I think is a true testament to its ties with travel and tourism. After all, it's where Marco Polo was born. But now, being a resident of Venice is kind of like an act of great resistance. There used to be a population of 120 residents, but now that number is closer to 55,000. People who once called Venice home have left, and citing infrastructure issues because many of the cruise ships have polluted the water, day trippers are crowding narrow canalways, and so on. Which might mean that if this number keeps dropping, it's sad to say, but by 2030, there might not be any more full-time residents of Venice, and it might turn solely into a travel-to city where commuters just come in daily to cater to tourists. Now, remember this essential shot of Mount Fuji we saw all over Instagram? Now, if a picture says 1,000 words, then what about the rest of the image outside of the frame? Here in front of you are super aesthetic people in front of an amazing view, but what about the street outside of the shot? This town is called Fujikawa Guchiko in the Yamanashi region, a place that became famous seemingly overnight for the unique view of Mount Fuji that you can see beyond the top of a Lawson convenience store. This shot has been replicated an innumerable number of times on social media, and I can't deny it. These shots are simply stunning. I mean, they're super aesthetic and beautiful, so of course anyone who's going to be in Japan or close by would want to see it. I have no idea what's happening outside of the frame, but I think a lot of residents could probably attest to this, because the people in this town have cited a lack of respect from tourists, including littering, ignoring traffic signs, or even climbing on top of nearby buildings to get a shot of Mount Fuji. And sadly, this has led to local officials deciding to block the view with a billboard. And for the locals, that sucks. I mean, imagine the feeling of the Japanese, the Venetian, or the Thai residents who literally watch their town or home get destroyed by people who don't live there. Over-tourism doesn't just affect locals negatively. It also diminishes the experience for the traveler, aka you. This reminds me of a time that I went to Kyoto in the middle of their high season. Every restaurant, and I mean seriously, every single restaurant that showed up on Google Maps had a 1 to 2 hour wait. And luckily, I didn't end up having to go there. I found another place. But can you imagine if you had to wait an hour for at least every single meal of the day on your trip? So let's just estimate 3 hours a day standing in line for overpriced food that you might not like, or even worse, doesn't truly represent the taste of the local cuisine. So in the end, you don't even get an authentic experience for waiting all this time. In Kyoto, I found this teeny tiny little hole in the wall place, and it was not Instagrammable, it was not chic, but the food was pretty good, and I was really happy because there was no line. But this got me wondering if maybe that's really the root of our problem, needing to get the perfect shot. I mean, is that really what modern travel is all about? Just taking a photo and not caring about the rest? I mean, what about the people who live in that country and the food that they eat, the handcrafts they make, the clothes they wear, the language they speak, and, how about all the years of cultural legacy left behind? I wonder, when did we lose the essence of traveling? And how is it that it became an outlet for online clout rather than new experiences? Well, regardless of the philosophical questions surrounding over-tourism, countries are now taking matters into their own hands. As you know, town officials blocked that famous view of Mount Fuji, but similarly in the Gyan district of Kyoto, there are now signs forbidding passage through some of the residential streets. In Venice, Italy, a daily tourist tax was implemented and charges anyone entering the city. And in a surprising turn of events, residents of Barcelona sprayed tourists with water guns while they chanted for them to leave the city. But there is one problem, which is that these regulations and these outcries haven't actually done much to solve the problem of over-tourism. Of course, people are still going to Barcelona, and the daily entrance fee of Venice hasn't stopped just as many day trippers from coming into the city. And regardless of the signs in Kyoto, there are still residents voicing complaints about people trespassing. Sure, these new rules may make an extra step or make it more challenging for people to travel to that place, but as long as clout travel is a thing, there will always be a new spot to visit, a new photo to take, and it's not a matter of regulation. I think it's a matter of mentality. So how can we as travelers change our own mentality around tourism? Well, let's start with this. Rather than chase beautiful photos, let's chase beautiful experiences. Let's immerse ourselves in the history, the traditions, the customs of a place, and let's try to understand it a little bit more and come out of our trip with a better sense of self and the world around us. Let's enjoy the architecture and the cuisine and the local crafts and the unique way of life. And let's say yes to these opportunities and experiences that we don't get at home. I would say that this is embracing culture and heritage tourism. So what is culture and heritage travel exactly? This type of tourism has been gaining steady popularity in the last few years, but indeed it's not a new kind of travel. People have been going to and enjoying different cultures really as long as people have been traveling. So it's not necessarily a new thing, but it has been rebranded as a solution towards issues in contemporary tourism, those issues that are really very new. This kind of travel goes beyond just seeing the sights. It's about connecting with the soul of a place. And the reason that this type of travel is so effective at combating over-tourism is that it puts the emphasis back on the specific place rather than just the single traveler. It also doesn't emphasize visiting one specific region or city. So for example, clout travel demands you to go see the Eiffel Tower in Paris. And it basically says, unless you went to that specific restaurant and got that specific photo, then you didn't actually go. But cultural travel encourages you to see some of the small towns or the wine regions or the hamlets or the little nooks and crannies of a city where a slower pace of life happens. So for example, you might instead go to Brittany, France, where you can get up close and personal with some of the Celtic roots there. You can hear about tales of seafaring and Breton folklore, or taste how coastal cuisine in France differs quite drastically from central France. Rather than emphasize photos or clout travel, culture and heritage encourages us to put our phones down and really live in the moment of that experience, whatever it is that we're having. So why is this type of travel important to the community? It's important to the community because it does foster a deeper understanding and respect for the cultures. It also encourages us as travelers to be more mindful of local people, of the local environment, and even take care to preserve some of that while we're there, even if for a temporary amount of time. So now this leads to the ultimate question of this video, which is, can culture and heritage travel save the tourism industry? Well, I sure as hell hope so. But there are some tangible benefits to culture and heritage that we can really emphasize and perhaps even promote in the tourism community. By promoting culture and heritage tourism, we can alleviate some of the pressures of traveling to these hyper-specific destinations. For example, someone who's already been to Kyoto might forego that second visit and instead head to a hidden gem or a small town. With less people visiting one specific area, it creates less congestion and quite literally makes it easier for locals to breathe and gives it a chance to recover from a really busy season. When going to these smaller towns, this event of cultural travel can actually help you boost local economies that might not normally get a lot of tourist dollars. And the other thing about it is that this type of travel really enriches the experience for both people who are traveling there and also the specific place, because there's shared interest in preserving it now. So if you want to get involved in culture and heritage travel, it's a lot more accessible than you might realize in the beginning. For example, I always had it in my mind that to be a culture and heritage traveler, I had to go to the rainforest and live with a remote tribe and not have service for 3 weeks. I mean, that is really cool. And if you can do that, it would probably be awesome. But the thing is, you can do culture and heritage travel in your own hometown or your own home state. It doesn't require you to leave your country because culture and heritage are all around us. For example, you could take a tour with a local historian or explore some of the more historic places of your town. There's a lot of interesting indigenous histories all over the United States that really are still waiting to be uncovered. But if you are deciding to get out of town, there are some ways that you can get involved with culture and heritage travel on the road. So for one, I would start by booking a sustainable accommodation. And by sustainable, I mean sustainable where they're taking the steps towards having a planet-friendly space and also culturally sustainable. Now, that might be a place that represents the local community well, and it can be hard to come by locally hotels and bed and breakfasts, but I do think it really is worth the effort, especially because large chains are often internationally owned with little to no connection, and unfortunately, they don't always have the best working conditions for employees. So, as an alternative, you could try agritourism at a local farm. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit, or stay at a small bed and breakfast. Now, there are some differences between a typical bed and breakfast and, let's say, a short-term rental on Airbnb. While there are many great hosts on Airbnb, there are also some issues with short-term rentals. And I'm sure if you've been on the news, you've seen some of the issues, or maybe you're even directly affected by them. And what happens is that while there's more short-term rentals being bought, there's fewer houses for people who actually live in these places and need to live there. So the demand goes up, and so does the cost of what's available. The other problem is that there's no maximum number of listings a single host can have on the platform. So that means if they have the financial capability to do so, a host could rent 20 spaces on Airbnb. 20 apartments on Airbnb means 20 fewer apartments on the market for residents who actually need to live and work in that community. But does that mean that all of Airbnb is bad or all hosts are bad? Certainly not. You can, as a renter, take some steps to even vet out the renter you're planning to book from and try to find someone who is ethically using the site. I actually wrote an article about this recently, so if you want some tips on that vetting process and trying to find a way to get with a host who's going to be a good person to buy from, I will link that in the notes below. And then another tip that I have is getting involved with the local food or the cuisine there, because I think food is actually one of the best representatives of culture. Anyone who travels, they need to eat, so of course, one of the universal similarities among people is a love for food. and a necessity to eat. It's amazing how two people who don't speak the same language can completely communicate without any words through sharing a meal together. And I think of food as like the ambassador of a country. The food represents the ingredients that grow in that area. It represents a style of cooking developed over possibly thousands of years, and the very stories of the ancestors who built those dishes you can experience. So if you eat at a locally run restaurant or a family run restaurant, you're of course directly contributing to that community. What's cool is that in these scenarios, you might be tasting a dish that's been in the family for generations. And so if you aren't sure how to find a local restaurant, you can start by asking somebody who, maybe works at your bed and breakfast or your Airbnb host or your hotel, even, asking a taxi driver, or, if you just happen to chat with someone on the street and they seem friendly, you might ask for some recommendations. I think word of mouth is usually a good way to go. And, I think if you say something along the lines of, hey, I'm looking for a unique experience with not a lot of tourists and it's family run, they'll probably get you in the right direction. And the other thing that I'm thinking right now as well is that there's a really great app called Eat With. And I think they have a website too. But if you go on to Eat With, you can type in the city that you're going to, and they'll share very specific local experiences surrounding food. Okay, up next is cultural activities. And of course, this one ties into culture and heritage travel perfectly because it makes us do something actively that involves us with that local experience. By embracing the creative elements that create a community, we're taking a history lesson. Before the Industrial Revolution, before mass production, before factories, there were artisans. Back in the day, if you needed tools or clothing or jewelry and weren't making these things yourselves, you'd go buy them from a craftsman who had the skills necessary to produce those things. But also, let's not forget about the stories, the dance, the music, and theater that you could find all over the world. In fact, the oldest recorded performance dates back to 2000 BC in ancient Egypt as a ceremonial play. As modern travelers, this tells us that communities have been coming together through different forms of self-expression for thousands of years. And if you go to a place with a rich history in dance, such as the tango in Argentina, you might take a dance class while you're there. And if you're intrigued by the artistry of Native American regalia and dance, you might take part in a powwow. Now, no one can expect you to be fluent in every language, and no one does, but there is something to be said for trying to learn a few words in that specific language. One thing that interests me to no end is learning how similar some languages are. Sometimes if you know a word in Spanish, you might be able to guess it in Italian. In English, a lot of English words have German derivatives, and so there are quite a few similarities there too. But even if it's a language that you have no experience in or ties to, trying to learn a few key phrases before you visit will most likely enrich your experience. Locals typically will appreciate your efforts, and they may even open up new opportunities for you to intermingle with people that you might not have thought previously possible. And now that leads me to my next point, which is supporting small businesses. So over-tourism and the consumer economy definitely go hand in hand. Cheap goods like fast fashion brands that are made to really only last for a few years work perfectly for that dream trip to Mykonos or Paris. A $15 dress, if it gets ruined, it doesn't really matter. So supporting businesses and artisans when you're traveling is so important. And this allows you to engage with the community and keep tourism dollars where they should be. A 2022 study by MarketWatch came to the conclusion that the average cruise passenger usually spends around $750 in a typical port city on a week-long cruise. Now, that in itself is a good thing, but consider that it only benefits businesses that specifically cater to cruise ship passengers. Those might be touristy restaurants or souvenir shops in that case. These businesses typically sell souvenirs that more often than not are not made in that country. They might even be manufactured from a large production country, for example. So try to look for things that are handmade or made by an artisan. Some of my most favorite things that I've found were one-of-a-kind pieces, or even pieces that I found in flea markets or antique shops, where they were just so unique and cool that I really wanted to bring it back home. And that, I think, is a really fun souvenir to have because nobody else has it. And the other thing that I really like about shopping small when you travel is that, again, it keeps tourism dollars where it should. So when you buy from a large multi-chain store, you're most likely investing in a CEO and, maybe they're trying to buy their second or third yacht. But when you shop small, you might be helping a little kid stay in school or getting food on a family's table. And I think that's a lot more meaningful than shopping at a larger company, even if it's a bit cheaper. So here's some more ways to travel ethically. One other way that I really like getting involved in culture and heritage travel is, for one idea, you can go to a place that might be like a hidden gem or, perhaps even just pick something on a map. In 2021, I began to realize that authenticity usually exists where there are fewer people. And while a smaller city or town might not be as fun or lively as a huge metropolis center, you might find some more charming qualities. So take, for example, Milan. Here you have a beautiful city where there are a ton of Italians living and commuting every day for work. There are skyscrapers and modernistic buildings, and that's all great. But I think some would say that Milan is not exactly the most culturally authentic city that represents Italians. If you want to see a more authentic side of Italy, I would suggest checking out a smaller nearby city. These are all really easy day trips from Milan, by the way. So if you wanted to stay from the majority in the city, you could really easily take a train to any one of these options. And if you want to get really crazy, there are much smaller towns and hamlets in the countryside that are literally untouched by tourists. And now ecotourism is another great option for the more outdoorsy folks. This relates to any type of travel that works towards improving the natural ecosystem of a place. According to a figure by the World Counts, there will be a 25% increase in CO2 emissions from tourism by 2030 compared to what it was in 2016. Ecotourism might include going for a hike or safari, bird watching, cycling, or maybe even walking in the park. You might decide to take part in an outing that's arranged by a sustainable tourism company. And I really like this idea because it doesn't require you to travel to some far off destination. Like I was saying earlier, you can participate in ecotourism in your own home state or country. Remember that figure I was telling you about there being 1 billion tourists traveling in 2024? Well, there are projected 120 million eco-tourists traveling this year, which tells me something. Eco-travelers are a small but mighty group, and they are growing in numbers every single year. So for those of us who are just getting into sustainable travel, this can be a really cool way to reconnect with nature and meet some like-minded people. Agritourism is the last idea. Now, this can be categorized under ecotourism. It's a type of stay or accommodation where you get to live on a farm or a place that produces some sort of agricultural good. Now, when I say that you're staying on a farm, please don't think that I mean you're sleeping in a pile of hay in a barn. No, agritourism can be actually quite sleek. What comes to mind is a wine producer who might open up their villa for a place to stay for tourists. Imagine waking up in Tuscany to the rolling hills and the green vines and spending your morning learning about wine production and harvesting grapes. Super cool, right? And speaking specifically of Italy, one of their largest agricultural exports is wine. So some of the definable attributes in Italy is having a high quality of food. And to me, that means that this is not only a great way to learn about the local economy, but understanding the essence of the Italian way of life. So the last thing I'm going to leave you with today is this. The tourism industry, it is problematic, but there is something to be done about it. And then rather than prioritize our aesthetic photos or getting lost in the social media sauce, let's all collectively go out and touch some grass, myself included. Consider that every time you pack your suitcase and you leave your comfort zone, that's an opportunity to gain a new perspective of the world. And getting immersed in another culture gives you really a chance to appreciate your own life through understanding someone else's. I think that's one of the great ironies of culture and heritage travel, which is that in the end, all these exotic, far-off places, communities are really not entirely unrelatable. In the end, we're all connected by some really profound similarities, and I think that's why we've got to keep traveling. So thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Yeah, all that other YouTube jargon, and please keep an eye out for the next one.